Regardless of where your allegiances lie politically, left, right, or in the middle, or how you felt about Charlie, I believe everyone can objectively take a step back and look at this case and realize there's parts of it that are hard to understand. They just don't make sense. How did a 22-year-old get on top of a roof at a security event, carry this out, and get away without being seen? That alone is weird, but it's not the only thing. And with that, welcome everyone. This is Data Divided, where we break data into what matters. I've spent the last 13 plus years building and applying analytical models in real world settings. I've also studied data science, analytics, and finance, which is a lens I'm bringing to this today. The goal is simple: use deep research, AI, and data science to uncover what's really going on, so we can separate what's being said from what the data actually shows. Real quick, if you'd like to support the channel, there's a couple ways to do that. You can like, subscribe. I have some additional links on this image. I appreciate any support at all, so thank you. So you might be wondering why someone who normally covers or creates content related to sports, sports cards, sports analytics, is doing a video on this topic. I think for me, throughout the years, there's been high-profile cases or incidents like this that have really grabbed my attention, really grabbed to that curiosity to figure out what's going on, right? What happened, why'd this happen, etc. And so doing this video really helped me figure that out to kind of give clarity of the whole situation. And hopefully that does this for you too as well. And so let's quickly talk about why some of these cases capture our attention, right? There's a psychology behind this, and they're deep, built-in psychological responses that really get us engaged into it. So the first one is pattern seeking. We're wired to solve things. That's definitely true for me as an analyst and doing that type of work. I love the solving things, these patterns, figure out mysteries, etc. Right? That really draws us in. Then it's the threat detection. When you see these types of things happen to people, you get this. It draws your attention and emotional investment. Third is the social proof and collective focus, right? When everyone is talking about something, our brain assumes that, this is important. We must draw our attention to it, right? It becomes a cultural moment. You could see on social media and TikTok and Facebook, kind of everybody was offering an opinion or talking about this case, right? The more attention it gets, the more it grows. So it becomes part of our social collective. 4 is the narrative tension, right? We want a coherent story, but high-profile cases are incomplete, messy, and constantly evolving. And that tension keeps us hooked, right? And that's certainly what's happening right now with this case. Identity and bias, right? People pick sides. So people will quickly form opinions about what happened and why, and once we pick a side, we look for evidence that supports our view and defend it. You can definitely see that happening right now. What's different about this video is it's very much going to be an objective look, and we'll cover that more in the next image. But this isn't about picking a side. It's about taking an objective look, looking at the facts, the information, the data, and going from there. But we'll cover that more. 6 is the illusion of understanding. We're given just enough information to feel like we understand what's going on, even when we don't have the full picture, right? That's true. People have come up with what the narrative should be, what the whole story, how it happened. So we feel like, enough. So we feel like we understand, but we haven't been given the full picture. And that's definitely true right now, right? 7, the curiosity gap. This is one of the biggest drivers. You know something happened, but not exactly how or why, right? The gap between what's known and unknown creates a mental itch, right? There's that urge to close the gap. And you can see with this case, they've been drip feeding kind of information. There are a lot of things that aren't publicly available. So, all of these triggers combined have really drawn people and into this case to figure out what happened and why. It's that also that true crime mystery or aspect to it as well. As I mentioned, we're going to take an objective approach to this case. So let's clearly state what that is, what it means, so we're all on the same page. An objective approach is a method of analyzing or evaluating situations based strictly on observable facts, evidence, and data, rather than personal feelings, biases, or opinions. The goal is for an impartial, neutral, and detached perspective, which is often used in scientific, academic, or journalist context, right, to ensure fairness. So one of the big things with that is we're presenting facts without favoring one side. We're being neutral. We're using fact-based evidence and data. We're going to use techniques such as data science and other analytical tools or processes to help figure out what's going on. So let's bring that all together, right? So right now, the problem is there's narratives versus facts. Most people are experiencing this case through media coverage, headlines, opinions, and social, which for the objective approach, people can introduce their own biases or personal feelings or opinions, which can help skew the narrative or facts, right? So we're going to try to cut through all that. The approach we're going to take is that data-driven lens, the objective approach. We break the case into components and analyze them with objective methods. We're going to look at the timeline, evidence, patterns, probabilities of things, right? We have upcoming forensic data analysis, behavioral and spatial patterns, Monte Carlo simulation, which is really interesting. We're going to do some modeling, right? So the goal is to provide clarity over narrative. This analysis is not here to prove guilt, prove innocence, push an agenda, or create a new narrative. It is here to provide clarity through objective analysis. And I believe that's so important. So before we get into analysis, there's a couple of things that we have to cover to establish and build a framework of this case or incident. And the first thing in that framework is to establish the timeline. So on September 10th, 2025, Mountain Standard Time, prior to 12:15 p.m., according to the FBI, the suspect arrives near Utah Valley University. The exact arrival path is unknown. There have been some videos online of the suspect approaching the campus, but it has not been clearly stated. At 12:15 p.m., according to court documents, the suspect walks upstairs towards the Low Center area, and hopefully I'm saying that correctly. And this is a confirmed movement in court documents. 12:17 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, shooter climbs over the wall onto rooftop, according to court documents. Between 12:17 and 12:22, the shooter or suspect moves across the rooftop, according to the court documents, right? And there's no public video of this phase. 12:22, the suspect enters a prone firing position, right, according to the court documents, facing the courtyard with a clear line of sight. According to multiple sources, video, and affidavit, 12:23 p.m., a shot was fired and struck Charlie Kirk. Between 12:23 and 12:24, according to FBI video and affidavit, shooter runs across rooftop. And that video is publicly available. The FBI put that out. So 12:23 to 12:24, shooter climbs down from roof. This is according from the FBI video. Okay. 12:24, the suspect runs north across Campus Drive, according to court docs. And there are witnesses that have confirmed that. 12:25, to 12:40, enters a wooded area, according to the FBI. Source type physical evidence. That's where they found this, possibly the rifle was dropped. And so this escape route is inferred from recovery. Shortly after, according to the FBI, the rifle was abandoned in wooded area. It says shortly after because they're not sure of the exact time. Also, shortly after, according to court filings, a shell casing was recovered on the rooftop. They didn't provide the exact time of when the shell was found, but they found a shell casing. Also, they found, according to the FBI, physical evidence such as prints, shoe palm, forearm, other things recovered from the rooftop scene. At 12:30 to 2 p.m., emergency response plus lockdown. This is according to multiple sources, Reuters, Associated Press, etc. The evening of September 10th, the FBI releases suspect images and video. Okay, September 10th to 11th, no suspect initially in custody, according to Reuters and other sources. Later that night, September 11th, the suspect identified by AP and Reuters, which is Tyler Robinson. That was a suspect that was named. The following day, on the 12th, the suspect surrenders. It was a peaceful surrender. And on the September 15th, according to the FBI, DNA linked announced to the towel and screwdriver, but no full report has been released yet. September 16th, formal charges were filed against Tyler Robinson. September 17th, according to official statements, suspect not cooperating with investigators. Later that year, additional forensic work ongoing, according to law enforcement, and it's not publicly detailed. So later in that 2025, there's a missing segment or a hole in this because there's a lot of information that has not been publicly reported or stated yet, right? And then so the most recent piece or information was in 2026 that, I believe this was a month ago, that ATF bullet fragment analysis was inconclusive, and this is according to court filings, right? And that's a key forensic item in this case. So ongoing, like I said, there are a lot of things that still are missing. There's a lot of that drip feed of information that we talked about earlier in the psychology triggers. So we have full forensic reports not released, transparency gaps remains, etc. So before we start deep diving in the evidence and talking about prosecution, defense, first thing I want to say is I am not a lawyer. I did not consult with a lawyer to help me put this together. Basically, my workflow for this is I looked at past historical high-profile cases and looked at what prosecution and defense did in those cases. So that helped me build out a framework, and I'm basically applying it to this case. I don't know what the prosecution is going to do in this case. I don't know what the defense is going to do. This is just my insight, my research going into this, putting this together. Second thing as well is the evidence. So this is an ongoing case, right? Trial starting, all of that. If somebody were to watch this a couple of months from now, the evidence could be completely different. Who knows? So I'm only referencing what's the evidence and storyline and information that I have as the day that this is published, right? So it should be sometime here early May, okay? So from my research, at a very high level, this is what the prosecution will do. First, they're going to establish the story. What happened, who did it, why it makes sense. They're going to build a narrative, right? And the next step they're going to do is support that narrative or story with evidence, physical evidence, DNA, weapon, forensic, if there's witnesses, digital evidence, etc. What they'll do next is connect everything together, right? Cause and effect, how each piece reinforces the other, how the evidence supports the narrative, right? And their other job is to eliminate alternatives, okay? They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this suspect committed this crime, okay? And it's a cat and mouse game between them and the defense on this, because the defense will try to poke holes, spin the narrative, and provide doubt into the story, right? But we'll get into that in the next part. So this is the first part of it. This is the narrative, right? This is a suggestion narrative that I put together that the prosecution could do for this case. So first they're going to say on September 10th, 2025, in Utah Valley, Orem, Utah, it was Crowder University. The event was going on for Turning Point USA. It was an outdoor speaking event. At 12:23 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, a shot was fired, a single shot, roughly 160 yards from an elevated position on a rooftop. The shot was taken with a high-powered bolt-action rifle, alleged, right? Later on, a 30-06. Okay. The suspect had a clear line of sight into the courtyard. The victim was sitting there in the middle in this outdoor state. So I'll reference this. The image in the middle is an AI-generated image, and I'll be transparent and call that stuff out. This is not an exact replica photo of the campus. It was just an AI-generated image to help explain the narrative or story. So we can see our shooter position was there on the rooftop. Clear line of sight. The victim was there in that crowded area, approximately 160 yards, okay? The suspect, who was identified as Tyler James Robinson, he's in custody. We've recovered the rifle. This is a multi-agency effort between local, state, and federal agencies. Okay, so that is our narrative. That is our first step. So the next thing the prosecution will do is support the story with evidence, right? In that prior image, we just established a narrative. Now we're going to support that with evidence. And one thing I want to note for both that narrative and this evidence, I'm basing this off of sources of it are the charging documents and official public statements, okay? Like I said at the beginning, I used historical cases of high-profile incidents like this, built a framework, and then taking that and applying it to this using actual data and information from these valid sources, okay? So let's walk through the evidence. The first one is the admissions or communications. There was alleged text messages between suspect and roommate, right? There are also messages on Discord, an alleged handwritten note. So a lot of this stuff is alleged, to state that out. DNA evidence. There was DNA consistent with the defendant on the rifle, screwdriver, and towel, right? And some of the items contain mixtures from multiple individuals, okay? There was a surveillance video, and all of these images are AI generated. That's not the actual surveillance video. So just note that. So the video shows suspect entering campus, moving across walkways, accessing rooftop, and leaving, okay? The fourth piece of evidence that they're going to bring in is the rifle. So this was the bolt-action rifle recovered in the wooded area. Once again, that's an AI-generated image. The fifth is the ballistic or bullet fragment. There was a bullet fragment recovered from the victim during autopsy. And then 6 is the trace evidence on the rooftop. So there were footwear impressions, palm and forearm imprints that were collected on the rooftop. So this is the scale of evidence that is currently public knowledge or that is available, okay? Now, I put status on there to provide a rank of how strong some of this evidence is. That could be an opinion or bias to that, so just keep that in the back of your mind. Somebody could say DNA is super strong. Others could say it's not, so just be aware of that. That's just a general kind of guideline there. One of the key takeaways, though, is the prosecution's case relies heavily on forensic and digital evidence, right? And so there can be a lot of interpretation with that. There's not a lot of eyewitness statements. There wasn't somebody who, worked with him or was right there, anything like that. It's kind of all based on this digital and forensic evidence. All right, so let's move on to the next step. So the prosecution has established the narrative. They brought forth their evidence to tie everything together. Now, the next thing they're going to have to do is litigate or argue for these gaps in this case, right? They need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So we're going to talk about some of those gaps that the prosecution will most likely have to litigate or confirm or prove beyond a reasonable doubt, okay? First one is the ballistics link. Initial federal analysis could not conclusively match the bullet fragment to what was recovered in the wooded area, okay? The fragment may be too damaged or insufficient for source attribution. So that's a big thing they're going to have to litigate or explain, okay? Next thing is the DNA evidence, right? DNA is consistent with the defendant found on several items, but there was a mixture of multiple other DNA on those items. So that brings into chain of custody and other issues, right? So they're going to have to litigate or explain that. The surveillance video, okay? Video timeline is central to the case, but full authentication has not been public, right? So they haven't brought out the metadata, export log, and original files have not been released. So far, it's just a video, right? So they're going to have to do more to prove how authentic that video is, okay? The post-event communications, okay? Alleged text, Discord message, and a handwritten note are key evidence, but they need to validate the chain of custody, prove that the suspect wrote that, etc. And then forensic and discovery gaps. So things that have not been provided yet, right? They have not provided on validation studies, instrument data, and analyst notes. So really the nuts and bolts of everything, the really detailed reports have not been made public, okay? So yeah, the kind of the key takeaway is the prosecution case has a critical gaps in forensic linkage, right? So authentication, context, and discovery. And so these gaps create reasonable doubt and must be litigated. That's the prosecution side job. So now let's pivot to the defense. So from the defense standpoint, in my opinion, and the research I've done, is the first thing they're going to do is challenge the story. Does this narrative actually hold up that the prosecution has presented? Then they're going to test the evidence. Is it reliable? Was it collected correctly? Can it be interpreted differently? Okay. Expose gaps and inconsistencies. We talked about that prior, but they're really going to go after that and expose those, right? The fourth thing they're going to do is introduce alternative explanations. Maybe offer other scenarios to it. Maybe the suspect, somebody stole this from his garage and used it, that type of thing. So offer alternative explanations. And then the last thing they really want to do is reinforce reasonable doubt, right? Because the prosecutors have to present the case and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this suspect was the one who did it and this is what happened. All right, so let's talk some strengths and weaknesses for the defense in this case. So in my opinion, here are the strengths of the defense's case, right? What can they challenge and create reasonable doubt? First is the ballistic link is inconclusive, right? The bullet fragment cannot be conclusively matched to the recovered rifle, okay? The DNA evidence, there's multiple sources of DNA on these different items. There's multiple contributors. Well, chain of custody, you can challenge that, right? So the DNA does not uniquely identify the defendant. He's on there, but it doesn't uniquely identify the defendant, okay? The surveillance video, the identity is not confirmed. The suspect identity is not verified. If you look at it, he's got glasses and hat on. These are all AI images, right? Remember that? So the video may show presence, but it does not identify intent, okay? Fourth is the timeline and motive is built on assumptions. The sequence relies on unverified events and witness estimates. There's gaps in the coverage and unknown variables, okay? So some of it is speculative on the timeline and how everything happened. Um, when was that rifle dropped in the woods? When it recovered? All that kind of thing, right? Fifth thing is the context and communications provide incomplete. The communications provide incomplete context. Some of the full conversations are not public. People have debated about the tone of the conversations, how it was presented, the speak in it, things like that. So, and you can also challenge the credibility or custody of that evidence. Sixth is the last part of the chain of custody in forensic processes. Questions remain. There's multiple agencies involved. How is everything handled, stored, transferred? So the defense can challenge the integrity of the chain. Okay? And remember, maybe these weaknesses do not prove innocence, but they show the prosecution's case relies on inference, interpretation, and incomplete evidence, right? And that can cast reasonable doubt. So now let's look at some of the weaknesses of the defense's case. So in my opinion, here are some of the weaknesses to the defense's case and where they're vulnerable. So one, the evidence still places him near the scene. There still is DNA on the rifle and his DNA on the rifle and towel. Video shows a person that looks like him on the campus before the shooting. Their cell data and messages suggest proximity, okay? Next is all those text messages. If they can prove that those are authentic, that they came from him, that's a very powerful thing for the prosecution because he lists out pretty much everything in those messages of why he did it and what he was doing, etc. Third is there's no clear alternative scenario presented. He is the only and main suspect. So there's not a pivot, or they haven't, the FBI and police, they haven't looked at anybody else. So it's hard to then pivot to provide an alternative scenario. And then some of the forensic evidence still points toward involvement. There are physical items that tie the defendant to the weapon and location. That's he's got his DNA on the rifle, other things like that. Okay. Complexity may be perceived as deflection. Technical arguments can be hard for juries to follow. There's an overemphasis on flaws, may appear as a strategy to avoid accountability. So what that means is that the jurors may see the defense as overcomplicating rather than clarifying, okay? And then 6, the burden of proof still works against the defendant. The burden never shifts to prosecution. The defense must still create reasonable doubt in the minds of 12 jurors. And that is difficult to do under any facts, okay? So key takeaway, the defense has strong arguments, but also faces real risk. Ultimately, its success depends on whether the weaknesses in the state's case outweigh these vulnerabilities, all right? And so hopefully that gave a whole holistic view of the evidence, the prosecution side, defense side, strength and weaknesses for both lenses of what's going on in the case. Okay, so this next section, these are open questions that I have as I was doing my research and looking at various different things. These are items that I still have on my kind of research list that I have questions about, okay? So first question, was the recovered rifle the actual weapon used in this incident? Okay, so we know that the ballistics match came back inconclusive. So was this rifle that was recovered, was this the actual rifle used? Okay. Second, how strong is the DNA evidence? Well, what I mean by that is there were multiple people on these items, right? Who are those other people? That hasn't been stated yet. Those are open questions. If we know that there's 5 individuals' DNA on a certain item, well, who are the other individuals, right? That question remains open. Are the surveillance videos fully authenticated, right? The identity of the suspect is inferred, but it hasn't really been confirmed or authenticated via metadata, export logs, and also there appeared to be a lot of cameras on that campus. Were there other videos or images that were involved in this? Because I think the only one that's been stated publicly is of the suspect running across the roof, and just those general images of him getting to that rooftop, right? And that's all been stated in FBI docs, court docs, etc. Are the footwear and handprint impressions conclusive? If that rooftop is easy to access, do we know that could probably be multiple footprints or handprints up there? Do we know for sure that those are the suspects, right? How reliable are the alleged communications? So there were a lot of communications on Discord and text and these hand notes. Like I said, some people have challenged the theme or the cadence within those. Did this person actually do them? Are they authentic? Has he stated that he did write those? I don't know for sure, right? I don't think that's been stated. Is the investigative process complete and discovery full? The defense claims key forensic case files and raw data are still missing. The prosecution is disputing this, saying it's ongoing work. So what is the extent of all this undisclosed material, right? So there's a lot of gaps and things that are unknown. You have, here's this video, here are these texts, here's this rifle, but things are popping up where, okay, this bullet doesn't match. Okay, so was this the actual rifle? Who are these other people on the DNA? So some of these questions need to be answered or resolved. So in that last section, we touched on key questions that remained with the evidence. Through my research, these are some key questions that I have that remain related to the investigation and timeline. One is the rooftop access failure. So the rooftop, we know, was not properly secured. He was able to get up there according to the timeline. Why was it? I guess the questions are like, why was it not secured? Why was there not? Was there a camera right there? Was there a drone? What happened? How was he able to access that rooftop? Questions remain around the security of that, right? So surveillance blind spots. Were there critical areas not covered by the camera? What was there certain angles that were missed? Because right now we only see just that one sort of image behind him when he's running across the roof. Were there other cameras with other angles or other images? Is the reason why there's not is because there's blind spots, etc., right? The event response delay, there was some time between the shot fired and law enforcement arrival. So it happened, and it seemed like the lockdown was later on in the timeline, right? I don't think there was a huge campus police presence, I guess. So I think part of that is if you're holding a big event, usually you have police there to kind of monitor the event. So the question is, was there a police presence there to watch or monitor this event, right? That I haven't been able to find if that's clearly stated. Now this is going 3, 4, 6. That 6 should be 5. But evidence preservation risk. So there was a large crowd there, right? And after the incident, it looked like there were kind of people running through the crime scene. There were people taking stuff down and evidence. So did they lock down that crime scene? Was there a formal investigation that way? Was there contamination of evidence, right? Things like that I don't think has been clearly stated or publicly out there that I've seen. And the last part is just the coordination challenges. So you had local police marshals, FBI, a lot of different agencies involved in this, and it appeared that at one point they had a suspect, then they didn't have a suspect. You know, some people were saying that this individual was caught. Then you had other agencies saying that there was not an individual in custody. So there seemed to be some interagency coordination challenges. That needs to be laid out clearly. So yeah, these are just some general key questions that I had just after doing this research. So let's move on. In this next section, I'm going to do a deep dive on the weapon system or alleged rifle that was used, the 30-06. By no means am I a weapons expert or a ballistics expert. This is the research that I found, that I put together related to this weapon. I think that's an important aspect for a lot of people. They hear 30-06 rifle and maybe not know what that means or what the differences are. So hopefully this will provide some clarity and maybe answer some of your questions that you have on it. All right, so let's get into it. Quick note for YouTube: this segment includes discussion of firearms strictly for educational and analytical purposes. The goal is to understand the evidence and context of the case, not to promote or instruct the use of any weapons, okay? So with that being said, let's dive into it. The first thing, right away, this needs to be established. What 30-06 actually is 30-06 is ammunition. It's not a rifle, right? So this was originally, ammunition was originally developed for the U.S. military in 1906. So when you hear a 30-06, that name literally means the bullet diameter, which is 30 caliber, and 06 is the year it was adopted, right? And so with that being said, when you hear a 30-06 rifle, certain rifles can accept that ammunition, right? And so the most common ones are the bolt action rifle, which we're looking at here, which was used in this incident. Some characteristics of bolt action rifles is they're manually operated between each shot. Shooter cycles a bolt, ejects spent casing, loads next round, right? It's known for precision, reliability, control. Typically, you'll put an optic on there of some sort. And then the other one is a semi-auto type one, which are less common, but they automatically load rounds after firing, right? But still one shot per trigger pull. So I hope to start off that clarifies a lot of things, right? Now, what the characteristics, they're engineered for precise shot placement, distance, effective at medium to long ranges, okay, control, emphasis on deliberate single shots, consistency, reliable, and repeatable performance. So it's not set up for volume or rapid fire, designed for intentional aim shots. So a very common application is hunting. Many hunters use this type of rifle, okay? That's why it's medium to long range and for precision, which is something that obviously hunters want when they're out hunting, okay? Since we don't know the exact type of 30-06 ammo that was used in this incident, we'll just quickly cover the overall landscape of it. So overall length, it's typically 3.2 to 3.3 inches. The projectile length, so the bullet itself, can vary roughly from 1 to 1.4 inches. The heavier the bullet is, the longer, right? So when I say that, there's bullet weight range. So there's 150 grain all the way up to 220 grain. And each one has kind of a different application, if you're wondering why there's so many grains. So 150 grain is typically a economical training. It's like a practice round. 150 to 165, you have soft point, which is for medium-sized game. You have 168 grain, which is match or competition. What it says if you're doing some sort of competition, so accuracy, consistency, and superior ballistic efficiency. 180, you have the 180 grain bonded tip. This is for large game and long range hunting. And 220, you have 220 grain is the round nose for close range, deep penetration, hunting, dangerous game, right? So that's the main overview of all the different weights and the type of ammunition that you can see with 30-06. In this next look, we're going to get a little bit more technical here, but I think it's important to understand. So what is this image showing? What's the big picture? This chart shows how much energy different 30-06 bullets carry as distance increases. So you have your left side, which is your energy power. Your bottom is your distance yards. And then each line basically is a different bullet type with a different weight, okay? And so what it's trying to show is how much force the bullet still has the farther it travels. We know that this was taken between that 100 to 200 yard range, and we could see that right there. So there still is a lot of force or power regardless of the bullet type, okay? And we'll get more into this, but you can see as it works its way down out to 800 yards, the force, the effective range starts to drop of the actual ammunition, okay? So when we say energy, we mean impact potential. So the higher the energy, the more force on impact. The lower the energy, there's less force, right? And what's interesting is not all these bullets lose energy the same way as you start working your way out distance-wise. And then also, so everything drops over distance. So the farther these bullets travel, the less energy or force, right? That drops the farther you go out yardage, okay? So no matter what the bullet type or anything, all bullets lose energy over distance. It's just physics, okay? And then some drop faster than others. And a lot of that matters about bullet design, okay? We won't get into all that quite yet, but so the 180 grain bonded, the orange one, that one holds its energy better than others, right? The 220 grain, which is the bigger one, you would think that the bigger, the more energy, right? So it starts strong, but then drops off faster than expected, right? Even though it's heavier, it actually loses energy faster, okay? And then you have your 168 grain, the blue line. That's more for consistency and efficiency at longer distance. And then the 150 grain, those lighter bullets tend to lose energy faster overall. So why does this happen? There's this thing called ballistic coefficient, but what we'll say is it's not just weight, it's shape and design. Some bullets are built to move through the air more efficiently, so they keep their energy longer, right? So to bring this kind of all back and let's move on here, the big thing or main takeaway I would say that to know is that, so you can have this one rifle that was recovered, but depending on the grain, the weight of the bullet, and the design, they can behave very differently and have very different energy impacts. But we can see between that 100 to 200 range, there's still a lot of force, kind of regardless. And why this matters for forensics, though, is that so the different bullets have different energy profiles, behave differently at distance. Okay, so we can, even though we don't know the exact type, we can sort of make some conclusions about potentially what size grain that was used. But like I said, from the 100, 200 range, there's still a lot of energy. And I don't want to get into the wound. I think, there was was there, but there's a lot of debate about that because these types of ammunition, the amount of energy they can carry, and that the force would have done considerable damage, right? Because I mean, it's used for big game and things like that. But we won't get into all that in this part. But yeah, all right. So let's move on. So we touched on this a little bit, but yes, bullets drop over distances. So let's look at that even closer. So this is a model trajectory drop with a 100-yard zero. On the left, you're going to see how far the bullet drops. On the bottom is the distance in yards. And then each line is a different bullet type. So basically, how much the bullet falls due to gravity as it travels. Okay? Yeah, so like bullets don't travel in a straight line. Even though we kind of picture that, they drop. Gravity pulls bullets down the farther distance you get out. So in that 100 to 200 yard range, we could see that if you had like a 220 grain, you could have up to 5 inches of drop. Okay. The 150 is less at 3.3. Reason why this is kind of relevant is there's been debate about where the wound was. There could have been possibly some bullet drop with that. Maybe the suspect was trying to aim somewhere else, and with that drop, that could have affected where the wound happened, right? But then there's still that toss-up of the other aspect of the weight, and we know how much energy and force is involved with this type of ammunition, so it's just tricky or interesting to think about, right? So what does, when I say 100-yard zero as well, so what I mean by that is all of these are calibrated so the bullet hits exactly where you aim at 100 yards. Okay, that's kind of the baseline for it. I think we kind of touched on everything here. So we talked about the energy, bullet trajectory, the drop, but that doesn't give us the full picture of what actually happens. Okay, so what I mean by this is it's called your terminal effect or framework, right? So what terminal effect means is what happens when a projectile impacts a target, specifically how it transfers energy, penetrates, and physically interacts with the material tissue it strikes, right? So even if we understand how a bullet travels, we kind of briefly talked about that, that still doesn't tell us what actually happens on impact. And same thing, right? Bullet energy, we saw that different grains and sizes have different energy levels, but a bullet energy tells you how much potential a projectile has, right? But not what it actually does with that energy on impact. Okay? So examples of that. So why in your mind you think, okay, energy, why is energy not enough? Okay, alone, like energy alone is not enough. You could have one bullet where it's high energy and then passes straight through, and then you could have another one where it's lower energy and expands and transfers energy inside the target, right? So bullet B would have a larger effect, and it was noted that at least in some of those statements that the bullet didn't pass straight through. Okay. So let's walk through this. The terminal effect. One is the bullet construction. Full metal jacket, soft point, match. So some of these, like match is not designed, is designed for accuracy, but not necessarily terminal performance. Like soft point and bonded, that expands and transfers more energy. Okay, so the bullet construction, impact, velocity. Okay, so we know that bullets lose velocity over distance, and that so many bullets require a minimum velocity threshold to expand, and so if bullet is below this threshold, the bullet may fail to expand. Okay, so the energy stays locked in and less effective transfer, right? So those closer distances, it could fail to expand, right? The third thing is the impact behavior. Does it stay stable? Okay. Does it yaw, which means does it tumble, turn sideways, fragment, right? And these can dramatically change wound size, energy distribution, things like that. The target, right? Is it just soft tissue that I hit? Did it hit bone? Were there clothing? Were there other things in the way of that impact? Because that can slow the bullet. It can change its path, etc. And then we said like the intermediate barriers, right? The clothing, other things that can also alter it. Okay. So terminal performance is a function of interaction, not just the energy output. You have to consider design, velocity, the behavior, the anatomy to really understand the real world effect and the impact it has. Okay. Yeah. So in that terminal effect framework we just covered, the first thing on that was the bullet construction. So I want to go deeper into that because that is such an important thing to understand. The bullet construction has more impact than just the caliber alone. So what does that mean? So the 30-06 is the caliber, but the way it's constructed can greatly affect the impact or the terminal effect. Okay. So we have 4 different constructions. The top, we have full metal jacket, soft point, bonded, and then match. So the typical wound channel for a full metal jacket is a small initial cavity, relies on yaw or tumbling to increase wound size. So expansion tendency is very low, but it has very deep penetration. Okay. Second is the soft point. This creates a moderate or to large cavity, so very high expansion, not as deep penetration. Then you have your bonded or tip, which creates a large, consistent cavity. So it has deep penetration. Okay. So generally, this is like used. The bonded is used for large game or tough animals. The soft point is generally used for hunting medium game. Okay. And then you have the match, which is used for target shooting, precision, which isn't ideal for hunting. Basically, the wound channels that can fragment or yaw unpredictably, right? Creating variable wound channels. So yeah, the bullet construction determines how the bullet behaves when it hits the target. Okay. So I hope this brings that all together. Okay, so we got to add another layer to this, and I hope you're not overwhelmed at this point. I know this is a lot of information and things to digest, but that's why it's important when there's a lot of talk about the caliber and the bullet, the construction. That's why it's so important to know all that information. It's because it's such an important part of the forensics, the analysis. Okay, so this layer. So what is this saying, right? Penetration does not drop linearly with distance. Velocity drops and expansion changes, but penetration often remains. So why distance alone does not determine penetration. And so it says, like, the conventional thought is if it was shot from a far distance, then penetration must be low. Or if it was shot close, it must be her a certain way, right? But this can change for a couple different reasons here. So let's walk through it. I have notes written down and I'm doing this. So the velocity matters and the bullet behavior, construction, velocity, why, and not so much the distance alone, right? If we're bringing that all together, and there's 4 different distance zones I have in this graph. You have 0 to 100, 100 to 300, which is that range for the current case that we're talking about. Then you have 300 to 600 yards, 600 to 1,000 yards. Okay, so you can see the velocity drops with a 30-06 caliber, but they still have high sectional density, which favors penetration. Okay, so what that means is distance changes how the bullet behaves, but not whether it can penetrate. So when we see that 100 to 300 range, we see that the penetration is very likely the bullet passes through when it's a large cavity. So reliable expansion, consistent full penetration. Okay, and then as you work your way up, that kind of cavity size decreases, but penetration is still likely, even out from farther off distances. Okay, and these all change depending on the caliber and things like that, but this is just specifically for the 30-06. Okay, and to note that like the human torso, so there's like 9 to 12 inches soft tissue, which has been talked about, it's not a difficult barrier for the 30-06. It's a very very powerful round. Okay, so we deep dive the ammunition. The next we need to look at some rifle configurations. And why is this important? You could have the same 30-06 ammunition perform differently depending on rifle characteristics, especially the barrel and twist rate. Just real quick on the bottom left there, you'll see the rifle system comparison. What was found was the bolt action rifle, okay? And all these rifle images, this is all for educational purposes to help explain this case, but the different barrel lengths can impact velocity change, energy change, recoil. And one of the other things to note as well is that you have what's called twist rate, okay? So what your twist rate does, it stabilizes the bullet in flight spin, okay? So the twist, it helps stabilize the bullet in different twist rates perform better for different grains of bullets and different types of bullets, right? So a 1 to 10 twist stabilizes 150 to 220 grain. A 1 to 11 twist is better for lighter bullets and can struggle with heavy ones, right? So why that matters, if a bullet isn't properly stabilized, accuracy drops, okay? So that's something to consider as well. And to remember, longer barrels equals more velocity, less mobility. The 20 to 22-inch barrels are the modern standard. And then twist rate determines the bullet compatibility, okay? So that's an overview of different configurations. And that's why knowing the rifle is so important. And we don't have all that details or information yet, okay? So one of the latest developments in the case had to do with a fragment of the bullet did not match or was inconclusive to the rifle. So let's quickly cover bullet fragmentation. Some people might be curious on that. I think everybody knows what like a fragment of something is, but let's talk about how that relates to bullets here. And once again, I am not a ballistics expert. This is just the information that I researched and found that I am sharing for y'all. So fragmentation, what it actually means. Okay, so there's 3 types of things. You'll see that these are all channels, and that's ballistic gel. These are all AI generated images. One of the first things that can happen if you hear the term expansion, bullet deforms but stays intact. It mushrooms out, okay? So it creates this giant cavity, this mass. The second thing that can happen is the bullet can yaw or tumble. Sometimes you'll hear cases about, I forget the soldier where the bullet hit him in one area, but then came out around like his arm, and then but came out around his leg. So bullets can tumble and do different things. And the last one, what they're talking about is fragmentation. Okay, so once impact in that gel, the projectile separates into multiple fragments. Now, this is a very exaggerated image of what that is. Not every time it fragments, it's going to look like that. It's just it's not mushing or tumbling, the bullet is going through and it fragments out, okay? And the fragments can travel into different directions, create multiple wound channels, things like that, okay? And so fragmentation is not expansion. Some bullets are designed to expand, but this one is it's a structural failure of the bullet. So we're going to go a step deeper in this next slide. We did a high-level overview of what fragmentation is. So let's specifically look at how it works with 30-06 ammo, okay? So as we mentioned before, there's multiple different grains and construction types of ammo. So let's quickly walk through all four. The first one on the left there is full metal jacket. Typically what happens is it stays intact at first, can yaw, turn sideways. The stress builds at a weak point and then eventually breaks apart at high velocity. So you can have multiple fragments, large wound path, high damage, okay? High fragmentation is likelihood at rifle speed. So the higher the speed is traveling, the more higher likelihood of fragmentation. Next is soft point. This is typically thought of as a hunting round because it expands. It spans mushroom, which we mentioned earlier, and it may shed fragments. So you could still have a mushroom out that might have tiny fragments, right? So there's variations to all this. Yeah, so the third one then is the bonded bullet. This is deep penetration, controlled behavior. This expands in a controlled way. The jacket plus core stay bonded and does not break apart easily. So this retains 90% of its mass. This type of bullet has low fragmentation. And then the last one is the match bullet. Okay? Now this one is a very thin jacket. It's not built for impact and stress. This is what people use for like competition shooting, as we brought up earlier. This can fragment violently. It's highly variable and can break apart aggressively at high velocity. So, how does this help us? Well, we know that multiple constructions of these could fragment. We don't have any insight as to if there was how much fragmentation there was. If we knew, that might be able to help us narrow down maybe the specific construction of the bullet that was used. Hopefully this will come out later on, but just remember this: if they do talk about, there was a ton of fragments, you can kind of go back and look at this and get a general idea of what the construction of that 30-06 ammo was that was used. This is the last section before we get into the data science analysis portion of this, but I think this is such an important thing to cover to help bring framework to everything. I think most people, if you haven't served in the military, or there are law enforcement, such as myself, the only background or reference to like these sniper type incidences is what we see in the movies. And that's not a really good representation to fall back on as we think about this and understand it. So I did deep research on how military or law enforcement conducts these types of things, because I think it's helped to ground us into reality of it than falling back to what is done in a movie, if that makes sense. So I think that's super important to help build and lay this all out, and it gives you an opportunity to see like how complex these stuff are. So let's get into it. Okay, so this is how it works from a military law enforcement perspective. So we're grounded not from what we might see in a movie. But first, this is the flow or diagram that I found during my research. So first, there's an objective, whether that be political or there's a clear objective, whether for national interest, security, etc. The second part is intelligence preparation. So they're doing a ton of different intelligence, right? Target development, pattern and life analysis, all kinds of different things. The third is the legal review. So they have to know, what are the rules of engagement? Do we have a legal precedence or case for this to do this action? Then 4, there's surveillance and verification. So there's continuous surveillance and tracking. Then once there's positive identification of the target, then there's a command decision, so multi-level approval process. There's an operational risk assessment, mission timing, etc. And then so the 6th part is the actual engagement, execution during the approved action window. And then afterwards is the assessment and after action. So battle damage assessment, intelligent exploration and forensic analysis, etc. Okay. So that's typical flow process of to help ground us instead of maybe reverting back to a movie type thing. Let's move on to the next part. Okay, so these are how some of these operations fail that I found in my research. So at this point, we know kind of one aspect of it, but and this is a good to realize for Tyler Robinson and those sequences of events, how none of these things impacted that incident. And yeah, so let's just quickly talk about it. So bad or stale intelligence, right? We know that he was able to hop up on the roof, get up there so quick, and then do this. How does he know that Charlie doesn't go to the bathroom or leave the area, right? So there's all of that type of way of thinking. Environmental base. So wind temperature and air density shift constantly, especially in urban environments, right? So like urban wind is chaotic. It's shaped by buildings, streets, and heat. Microclimate changes by the minute and by the block. So there's all kinds of variables that had to go right for him in this instance, right? From that aspect, like the wind and just everything else. Then also you have like line of sight too. What if he got up there, but then he didn't have a clear sight at the time, right? So did he scout beforehand to figure all this stuff out, right? It makes you really think about kind of the process and all this. So then there's like target pattern, misreading route routines and route changes, delays and disruptions. What if the show was delayed, right? Because it's like he came up to campus, made his way right up to the roof. There wasn't like as far as we know, he sat somewhere and got coffee. It's like he was there, went right up, so he knew that it was going on. And I don't know if that's because I believe they film it and things like that. So that's another aspect as well. Also, the to mention with that is just the density of people, right? There's people everywhere in that space. So that has another element as well. This wasn't conducted in where Charlie was alone somewhere. This was done in a crowded space, which just adds another layer of this, right? You have the signature and concealment failures. There's cameras, witnesses, and digital sensors. So they have shown that there are some images and video of it. We haven't seen all of it yet, but that is one aspect of it. But it appears that it didn't stop the incident from happening, if that makes sense. And then there's technical and human error. The weapon or optic malfunction, right? It sounds like there could have been some reassembling and assembling of this weapon, and that can cause malfunctions in errors with the optics. Plus, there's misfires, jams, all sorts of things can happen. Plus, stress, fatigue, or overconfidence. This young individual gets up there and doing this in front of all these thousands of people. There's a knowing that the outcome for him is, if he gets caught, is, like knowing that he'll be taken out right away, essentially. So it's there's that level, almost like in The Butler when they took that guy out like right away. Like there's that aspect of getting up there knowing that he could be. So that adds another complexity, right? Then you have the ballistics DNA prints. So far, which is super, think about it, the DNA there's multiple DNA on it. On some of these items, the ballistics is inconclusive. There is video, but it's not, you can infer if that's him or not, right? So it's really interesting when you look through the scope of this, excuse me, how wild like all these things had to be for this event to happen, right? And then plus when you think about afterwards, after the shot, there's movement patterns. People are going to be running everywhere. There's traffic and crowds, all sorts of unpredictable patterns and things can happen, but that didn't seem to prevent him from getting away, right? All right, let's move on. So now we need to flip it and look at how military and law enforcement responds to these types of incidents, right? And we'll kind of follow this along, and this will kind of help with what's currently going on. So the first thing is ballistics and trajectory. Bullet recovery and matching, trajectory reconstruction, angle, distance, and elevation modeling, firearm type and caliber identification. As we know that they've done an analysis on that fragment and didn't match the rifle, but they've recovered the bullet and other things. We don't have all the information, but that's kind of step one. Two, scene and physical evidence, shell casings. We know some shell casings were found, fragments, fingerprints. We know their DNA. There's multiple DNA on there. Materials, fibers, any trace evidence. Third is the video surveillance network. They'll look through video at traffic, rooftop, business cameras, timestamp movements, facial recognition. We've known that the FBI has put out a couple of images of the suspect. It shows the suspect running off the roof, but we don't know what other information is involved. Four, the digital and comm data. They'll ping cell tower data dumps, look for location pings, encrypted app metadata, those Discord messages, text messages, right? Witness and human intelligence, eyewitness accounts, informants, local sources, behavioral analysis, and pattern recognition. So they'll interview all people at the crime scene, the people who attended the event. They interviewed his roommate, all that stuff. Six. And then the multi-agency fusion and attribution. So you had the DA working with the FBI working with local authorities, all that stuff, right? So the main thing they do is observe, collect, correlate, analyze, attribute, and prosecute, which we're now in that prosecute phase of all this. Okay, now we are moving into my wheelhouse. Up to this point, I've put disclaimers on things where, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a law enforcement or military or a ballistics expert. We've looked at the timeline, the weapon system, we've looked at prosecution, defense, all sorts of different aspects of the case. And now we're going to get into the analysis and data science. Right. So what is data science? I think if you were to ask multiple data scientists, you might get a different answer. But I believe it's a 6-step process. This is what I refer back to and how I do my scientific approach. So first is identify the problem. Now, all of that framework was helping us identify the problem, bringing us context to the case, looking at all those different aspects, right? So what we're doing is we're looking at the Charlie Kirk case and comparing it to other cases, right? And seeing if there's any patterns, anything that we can extract from it, right? Second is gather the data. I'll walk through each one of these sections after this because I have slides on each part of this, but second is gather the data. Third is cleanse the data. Fourth is then model selection. If you're doing a regression, logistic regression, linear, there's all sorts of different models. Fifth is to evaluate your results, test performance, and validate insights. And sixth, the last part, is present results. And so this is what we will be following going forward. We've kind of been following it the whole time by this step one. Now we're moving into step two, and then we'll talk about 3, 4, 5, etc. This next section will cover step 2 and 3 of our data science process of how the data was gathered, collected, and then how the data was cleansed, etc. Okay, so now we are moving into the analysis section. Now this is my wheelhouse. With things before this, I had to put disclaimers on. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a forensic analyst. I'm not a military law enforcement, anything like that, ballistics expert. But this is my kind of contribution to this whole thing, okay? So I wanted to build out a data set. And what I did is I have a total of 148 incidents. So what did I do to define my scope and criteria? So I did targeted attacks on high-profile individuals. I didn't look at mass shootings or anything like that. It was all targeted attacks on high-profile individuals. I have, obviously, the Charlie Kirk case. I have, going back to like Tupac, Biggie Smalls, Gianna Versace, from political to celebrity to Martin Luther King, all kinds of different incidences of high profile individuals. I will try to get this data set up so everybody can kind of look at it, but it includes politicians, public figures, executives, journalists. I have like the Brian Robinson case, all kinds of things. So it excludes random crimes and unrelated incidents, focuses on documented incidents with sufficient information. What that means is I wanted to find cases with a lot of information and documentation around it, so we can help answer questions for our analysis. This 148 doesn't encompass all of these incidences, but a lot of times, if it's not high profile, there's just not as much information in to go off of. And I used credible sources in this, right? So, okay. Discovery and source strategy. So comprehensive search across global news archives and public records. We'll look through different, it was multi-language language. So basically this had to do with creating an AI agent to go through, scan all these articles, build up the data set, used verified sources. Okay. So it had to have at least one authoritative source per incident. Like Associated Press would be an example, right? So I prefer official bulletins and major media, excludes unverified social media claims. So there's no data in this related to anything you'd see on social media, etc. Extracted key fields. So I have things like the date, the location, the weapon type, the venue, victims, the motive, perpetrator status, etc. And I standardized formats across all records. I did some normalization of other records, and we'll go through more of that and what that means. Data quality and integrity controls, flag data quality and confidence levels. I track source notes, so everything has every data point notes the source where it came from, right? Had to, if there was, in the first pass, there were data points that were missing from the overall data set, I dropped those incidences out of it, right? So there's no me randomly filling in NAs with something, if that makes sense, okay? And then feature engineering, I created derived metrics, different variables, things like that. So I think that's enough for without having to go through the whole thing. You can read that, but that gets us started into the data collection and methodology process. This is super important to cover as well, the data limitations and bias. So understanding the limitations and potential biases in the data set ensures accurate interpretations and presents over generalization. So selection bias. Data set includes targeted attacks on high-profile individuals, but it's not representative of general violent crime, right? The overall general violent crime landscape. It's skewed towards politically, socially, or publicly viable cases or visible cases. Reporting bias. The incidents rely on publicly reported information, right? So underreporting could be in some areas, overreporting. Some facts maybe aren't. I don't know. Like if I report on use the case as a data set, 6 months from now, something about that case could change, and then so that data. So there's that sort of bias as well. Missing data. Some fields have higher unknown rates, so we got rid of a lot of that, pretty much all of it. But it's still tracked in the data set. It just won't be a part of the analysis, if that makes sense. Sample size constraint. So some categories have limited observations, right? There's also with the sample size constraint, this isn't every high profile incident that's ever occurred in history. So there's people can say, oh, you cherry picked or selection bias, which we mentioned, but we're calling it out. We're basing it off of our definition of high profile, right? Maybe if you look through the data set, there's somebody that you think should be on there that's not, right? So this is just calling that all out, right? And also results are directionally useful, but not statistically definitive, right? And we'll kind of get more into what that all means. Survivorship and documentation biases. Cases with clear narratives are more likely included, right? Complex or unresolved incidents may be underrepresented because we wanted to figure out cases that had a lot of details or information. So if there's ones where there are a lot of complexities and a lot of information is available, or the information is all over the place, those probably weren't included, right? So, key insight: the data set is structured, transparent, and intentionally scoped, but it reflects documented high-profile incidences and not all real-world events. Okay. So we're going to quickly cover the data dictionary. This is part 1 of 5, but we'll quickly move through this just so you get a full scope of what's in the data. There's the incident ID, incident name, date, year, region, state, location detail. I won't read everything on there. You can pause and look through all that. So let's go to part 2. So this part of the data then now covers environment and weapon context. So it has like the setting type, engagement context, the different aspects of the firearm that was used. Okay, so the next section is going to cover the victims and outcomes. So I want you to remember this and keep this in the back of your head, is that each data point represents a real person. These are not numbers. They reflect human lives affected. So with that, this analysis is conducted with care, respect, and an understanding of that impact. The goal is to not reduce these events to statistics, but to use structured data to better understand patterns, context, and outcomes without losing sight of the individuals behind them. Maybe this analysis can bring the light and prevent future events like this from happening, right? Okay. This part of the data covers the intent, behavior, and signals. So basically, what was the relationship? What was the victim relationship? What was the intent type? What was the shooter gender? What was the time of day? Okay, this part's also very important to cover on is the data integrity and modeling field. So you'll see included in analysis, if there was a data record that was missing, it was not included in the analysis. So if each one of these fields is populated from the source, and I put the source name in the URL, if it wasn't able to populate that specific field, like shooter gender or things like that, it's not included in the analysis, okay? Okay, so we're moving into step 4, the modeling. So this section is going to get a little bit more technical. Basically talks about the modeling. So in math, when you did a math test, you couldn't just give an answer, right? You had to show the work, what went into getting that answer. And that's what kind of this section is the work that went into getting the answers. If you don't want to know all this, you can just forward on to the output, but I want to cover this, right? So how I do my analysis is I usually start very simple and then work my way up to more complex. So you can see, to begin with, we're just doing like distribution calculations, severity metrics, looking at averages, total incidence, that very simple stuff. And then we work our way up to pattern detection, outlier identification, Monte Carlo simulation, where we basically simulate 100,000 Charlie Kirk incidents. All of this is done in RStudio. That was my analytic tool or platform that I used. Okay, so let's move on. So this is to show the calculation. So I don't show any of the R code. So I have the output, but I don't give out, like, I don't show you the whole R code block of what I did. So I just wanted to quickly show it here as a reference, how I did frequency counts. This is the R code I used. For the severity metrics, here's my formulas and the R code I did, percentage calculations. So this is more of a reference if you want to look at this when I do my outputs and come back to this to get how I calculated certain things. That's what this is for. So this covers the Monte Carlo simulation and rarity scoring model. So what I did is, for each data point, I created an incident profile. I took the firearm category, engagement context, setting type, intent type, and victim relationship in that data point and combine it. So, like, as an example, this incident, there was a rifle, it was a targeted distance, it was public, targeted assassination of a public figure. I observed how frequently that profile appeared in the data set. Next thing I did is I did a Monte Carlo simulation of these incident profiles by repeating it 100,000 times. So what it does is it gives us our observed real world frequency of these profiles versus a simulated expected probability of that profile happening. Okay. Then I did a rarity index calculation and I did rarity tiers. So some of these events are very common, some are uncommon, some were rare, and some were extremely rare, okay? So let's get to the outputs. Okay, so getting back to our process that we talked about. So we did step 1, built out the framework. The data's been gathered. Data's been cleansed. I just talked about model selection. So now I'm going to evaluate the results and present them to y'all. So for YouTube, this content is for educational and analytical purpose only. It discusses firearm-related data in the context of research and public information. It is not intended to promote, encourage, or instruct the use of weapons in any way. Okay, so we start out simply here with a firearm distribution. So over 80% of incidences in the data set involve handguns, while rifles account for about 16%. So the data is heavily skewed towards handgun-related cases, even though perception may suggest otherwise, right? We see the Charlie Kirk case. We see the Butler, Pennsylvania case. Most recently, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which isn't in this data because this was already finished by the time, but you can see that some of these more public ones involve like a rifle or shotgun, but the perception is most of them in this data set, 80% have handguns involved, right? So one other thing to note, though, is that this doesn't mean one category is more severe than the other. It's just simply showing frequency, not impact. What it tells us is how often each type appears, not how all these incidents play out, right? So it's just the frequency of that. Let's see, what else do we have. I think we got. Now, I don't want to do speculation why handguns to rifles because I really don't know. I can offer opinions about that. Probably because maybe handguns are easier to conceal, but I think if you're for the Charlie Kirk case and specifically where the shooter was or the suspect was at such a far distance, you're obviously not going to use a firearm or excuse me, a handgun with that. So I think the distance and location and everything like that kind of dictate the firearm that's used, right? Okay. All right. So this next look is engagement context. So what does that mean? Engagement context looks at how these incidents occur in terms of distance and environment. And if you look at the bottom left, you'll see 76.3% of incidences are close range among incidents with known engagement context. To the right, so we have a raw distribution of all incidents. There's 34 of that 148 that are not known in terms of the engagement context. So those are not included in the this distribution or slide. Okay. So what exactly, when we say close range, public proximity, and distance targeted? So the best way to think about it for close range specifically would be, for public proximity would be street confrontation or at a bar or restaurant, but it's still close range. So like the Luigi Mangione case, that would be close range, but in a public proximity setting, okay? The close range where not public proximity would be, you see incidences of these attackers coming to the person's private residence, right? Or some sort of isolated location. And then the long distance is just shots from afar. I think that one's pretty clear. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Public proximity is still, you could say, still close range, but it's in that public setting. Okay. Let's see. Okay. I have notes written down here. Okay, so this is important because perception can be skewed towards more visible or dramatic scenarios, but the data shows that most incidences don't occur at extended distances. Okay. If we include all incidences, including unknowns, close range still leads, but drop to about 59% of total cases, which shows how missing data can shift the picture. But the key takeaway here is that close range encounters dominate the data, and long distance scenarios, are relatively uncommon. So it gets interesting if you think about like the White House correspondent dinner. That was a public proximity, close range, and the guy had a shotgun, which we know is a rare weapon type. So you can see kind of how all these work together as we start building out incident profiles here. Now let's look at how outcomes vary depending on the type of firearm involved. In the data set, handguns account for the majority of incidents, right? But when we shift from frequency to impact, a different pattern emerges. On average, handgun-related incidents result in about 1.12 fatalities and 0.62 injuries per incident, the lowest among the categories shown here. Rifles fall in the middle with slightly higher average for both fatalities and injuries. Shotguns have the highest average number of total victims per incident. But that's based on a very small number of cases or sample size. So there's just 4. So interpret that with caution. So this is where, so the most common type handguns tend to have lower average impact per incident, while less common types can show higher per incident outcomes. Okay. So how does that exactly mean? So with the shotgun, you do have a fatality, but then the firearm might have spread and other people could get hit by that, right? Same with rifles. Maybe there's that fatality, but we know that rifles have high pass through, and so other victims could be hit in the process. Where it's saying with the handgun is that there's still that fatality, but there's lower average victims, meaning that less people are hurt in the incidents, right? And then, when we look at the rifle and shotgun, remember that these are smaller number of incidents where your handgun is a larger spread. But yeah, interesting look here. All right, so let's look at the intent. This is understanding the motivation behind these incidents in the data set. Okay, so what's actually driving these incidents? Across the data set, the majority of incidents are intentional and targeted. The largest category is targeted assassination, accounting for 45.9% of the cases. Close behind is targeted and personal with 39.9% of the incidents. When you combine those two categories together, 85.8% of incidences are targeted in nature. By comparison, indiscriminate incidents with those without a specific target account for just 13.5%. Okay. So case where intent is unclear or extreme rare in this data set. So some of this can be subjective a little bit, right? I like to think about it as this, in this instance, what this all means is, so when you think of targeted assassination, it would be like Tyler Robinson didn't know Charlie Kirk like personally, but he targeted him. The targeted personal would be the individual had a relationship, they knew them. You see these cases where maybe a family member or a friend targeted the victim. Indiscriminate, now it could appear like you could look at the Luigi Mangione case and just see that somebody, maybe they were trying to rob somebody, and it could look that way, but then as you dig deeper, it became a targeted assassination. But I would say the indiscriminate is more like a robbery gone bad, that type of situation. Okay. So yeah, and it's just saying that when you look at all in the data set of all these cases, it's very rare that one of these acts is random, if that makes sense. Okay. So when you think about it from like a law enforcement FBI perspective, you would say that once, if you saw one of these things happen, you would look towards, personal relationships. Somebody targeted this individual as opposed to more of a random act. Not that couldn't happen, right? It's just kind of where you go and start with. All right. Okay, so let's look at when these incidents occur. When you break the day down across the day, the distribution is relatively even. The afternoon shows the highest share at 30.4% of incidents. Morning accounts for 24.3%. Evening comes in at 22.3%, and night represents 23% of incidents. So while there is some variation, the difference between the highest and lowest time windows is only about 8%. And that tells us something important. There isn't a single time of day that clearly dominates. Instead, incidents occur consistently across the entire 24-hour cycle. So this suggests that timing by itself is not a strong predictor. These events are not concentrated in one specific window. They can occur at any point throughout the day. Okay, so let's look at whether there were warning signals before these incidents. At first glance, there might be an expectation of clear indicators leading up to these events, but the data shows something different. In 79.1% of cases, warning signal information is unknown. Okay, so that's 117 out of 148 incidents where there isn't enough data to determine whether any warning signs were present. And only 20.9% of incidents, or 31 cases, had documented warning signals prior to the event. And this introduces a major limitation. Not necessarily a lack of warning signs, but a lack of recorded or available information about them. So as a result, it becomes difficult to draw strong conclusions about pre-incident behavior. What can be stated clearly is this: only about 1 in 5 incidents have documented warning indicators in the majority of cases. And then there is simply no record of what, if anything, was observed beforehand. So the takeaway here is not that warning signs don't exist, but they are often not captured, reported, or accessible in the data. And some of that has to do with the historical context of how far back our data goes. It's just some of the reporting on this, there isn't as much information as maybe cases that happened, recently. All right. Okay. So let's connect weapon type to how these incidents actually occur. Okay. This is a cross analysis, shows the engagement context in which each weapon category is most commonly used. So if we start with handguns, which account for 81.1% of all incidents, the dominant pattern is clear. 71.7% of handgun incidents occur at close range. Public proximity accounts for just 5.8%, and 22.5% remain unknown. So for handguns, the pattern is heavily concentrated in close range interactions, which makes sense. Now shifting to rifles, which represents 16.2% of incidents, the pattern changes significantly. The majority, 62.5%, occur in public proximity settings, and another 28.8% are distance targeted, right? Which makes sense. While close range use is relatively rare at just 4.2%, right? So unlike handguns, rifles are more commonly associated with distance and public facing context, right? Finally, shotguns make up 2.7% of incidents, showing a different limitation. So they say they fall in the unknown category. That might be a lack in the data, or I would assume that shotgun would fall into the close range or public proximity, right? Close range and in public. Okay, just using logic and common sense. But if it's not clearly stated in the data that it's that, or excuse me, clearly stated in the reporting, I didn't make that up and put in just guess close range. I just left it unknown, and that's the same with handguns. So if there wasn't a clear stated in the reporting of it was at close range or public proximity, it was just left unknown to not, I'm not adding in or filling out the data. But you could, looking at it and just use logic, you can assume that a shotgun was in a close range setting, right? And same with handguns. And not surprising that rifles are more at distance, because I think each one of these weapon systems has a yardage of engagement, right? Bolt action you can use for long distance shooting. Handguns, after 100 yards, you're not going to have the same accuracy as you would with a rifle. So things like that. So this makes sense. All right, now let's look at where these incidents occur. The data breaks into incidents down into 3 primary environment types. The largest category is public settings, which accounts for about 68.9% of all incidents. So that's 102 out of 148 cases occur in places like streets, parks, and other community locations. The next category is residential settings, making up about 20.3% of incidents. These occur in private homes, apartments, or other residential properties. Finally, workplace environments represent the smallest share at 10.8%. These include incidents occurring in businesses or professional settings. So the distribution is heavily concentrated in public environments, with residential settings as a distant second and workplace incidents making up a relatively small portion. When public and residential settings are combined, they account for about 89.2% of all incidents. This means that the overwhelming majority of cases occur in everyday environments, not isolated or specialized locations. So the key takeaway is this: where an incident occurs is most often a public or residential setting with public environments dominating the data set. Okay. Now this is where it gets really interesting, because so for residential, inside the home or apartment, but there are incidences where somebody is outside of their home on the street or outside of their home on a sidewalk and the incident happened, that would account for public, even though it's in that residential area. So it gets tricky when you start intertwining the residential and public. And I know with a prior slide, we were talking about how the public and these various instances occur with weapon types and things like that. But there's a lot of, like I said, like you could be out in front of your home on a street and that would account for public, even though it's residential. And there might not be anybody around, right, for public proximity. So it gets a little convoluted in those ways. So that's one thing you got to remember or think about. Okay. Okay. So let's bring everything together into a single profile. Okay. This represents the most common combination of factors observed in this data, or the most common pattern observed in the data. The most frequent profile involves a handgun. In terms of engagement, it's close range. Setting type is public. Intent type, targeted assassination, victim relationship, public figure. Okay. With all these factors combined, this single profile appears 31 incidents, representing 20.9% of the data set. So this is not a rare combination. It's the most common pattern across all variables. The broader implication is clear. These incidents are not random. They follow a consistent, repeatable structure across weapons, context, setting, intent, and target. So the key takeaway is this: the data points to a dominant incident pattern, not a random distribution. Okay. I like to think about it. Look at the Luigi Mangione case. That is the most common incident profile. With Charlie Kirk, this situation, it is not the most common incident profile. Okay. What that means, we can't draw on conclusions and things like that. And I'm going to sum that all up at the end, but that's just something to think about when you look through it. A lot of these common incidents are like the Luigi Mangione, these rifle long range incidents are not common at all. So when we were building out our framework, we went really heavy into rifles and 30-06 ammunition, but we know that handguns are the most common weapon system, so we're going to cover that, just some of the differences between the two. And for YouTube, this is for educational purposes only. We're just trying to understand the differences between handgun and weapons. We're not promoting the use of either one of these things or how they function. This is just to help us better understand what was used in the Charlie Kirk case compared to what's used in most of these incidences we've documented. Okay. All right. So there's a lot packed in this image, and let's go through it. Obviously, we did a strong review of the 30-06 ammunition, and now we're going to look at handgun rounds. I would say the three main ones that we're focusing on here is 22 long rifle, 9mm, and 45 ACP. Those are probably the three most common ones, in my opinion. Some people might think differently, but those are the three that I associate with handguns the most. But let's talk about the big difference versus rifle. So 30-06 rifle, and remember, 30-06 is not a type of rifle. It is a rifle that shoots 30-06 ammunition. So if you got that, bring that back. So With handguns, you'll have them chambered, the barrel's chambered at 9mm or 22 long rifle, things like that. But yeah, so velocity is a lot higher for rifle. So 2,600 to 2,900, feet per second versus handgun rounds. The velocity is 800 to 1,300 feet per second. Typically, there's a large temporal cavity with rifles and a minimal temporal cavity with handgun rounds. Rifles are very energy dominant. That's why hunters use rifles when they hunt for big game or deer or whatever, as opposed to a handgun, because there's a lot more energy, more distance, larger wound, right? You're not going to get that with a handgun, okay? Handguns mostly used for self-defense or law enforcement, things like that. So with rifles, almost always penetrates torso across distance. And then for handguns, that penetration depends heavily on bullet design. So you can see that these circles kind of have, these are called energy dispersion profile, relative comparison. So there's a large energy transfer zone with rifles. With 9mm, there's an even, that's the 1,000 to 200 transfer zone, and then 45 ACP is even a lower velocity because it's a larger bullet. Okay, time to target, handguns are much slower than rifles. A lot of these are less than a second. So, but the handgun projectiles, they drop more, take longer, and more sensitive to movement. And then these are, if we look at 22 long rifle, 9mm, and 45 ACP, behavior and penetration, a lot of that depends on the bullet construction. If it's full metal jacket, hollow point, things like that. A hollow point will have a large expansion. While some, if you look at like full metal jacket, it has a higher likelihood of pass through or deep penetration. Okay. And then here are some of the velocities from distances 0 to 50 yards, 50 to 150, and 150 plus. 150 plus is very hard shot, in my opinion, with a handgun to make. So I think that's less common. But yeah, so now we'll talk about pass-through likelihood summary just by distance and caliber. So when we look at 45 ACP, there's less likely pass-through between 0 and 50 yards. So 45 AC... Okay, let me step back on this real quick. So we have the 9mm, but it's framed out as hollow point and full metal jacket. 45 ACP is hollow point and full metal jacket, okay? So those are the two different bullet constructions when I say that. So from 0 to 50, that's very close range, right? With 22 long rifle, there's a possible pass-through. 9mm with a hollow point, there's moderate pass-through. And you can see with full metal jacket, it's likely pass-through. And then that kind of shifts all the way through as you work your way out, because I think the 0 to 50 yards is the most common distance range for this type of ammunition and weapon. Okay? So handguns are penetration limited systems. Rifle are energy dominant systems. Okay? And then the handgun effectiveness drops faster with distance. All right, so in the prior image, I touched on full metal jacket and hollow point, so we're going to go a little bit deeper on that and what the differences are. But at a high level, design determines how a bullet behaves on impact, which in turn controls both penetration and cavity size. So if we start with full metal jacket, this design is built to penetrate, not expand, and you can see that in the ballistics shell. So typical penetration is 16 to 30 inches in gel, and this depends on caliber, velocity, and bullet weight. These rounds typically maintain their shape on impact, and then creating a small, consistent channel through the target. And the likelihood of a pass-through is higher than it is with hollow point. So in contrast, hollow point rounds are designed to behave differently. These rounds are engineered to expand on impact, and you can see that in the ballistics gel. You can see that large expansion, which creates a larger cavity, and then the penetration is controlled by design, right? And so the pass through is less likely. And so they're engineered to expand on impact. Um, and then you can see that the penetration in the gel is between 12 and 18 inches as opposed to the 16 and 30 inches. Um, okay, so less expansion leads to more penetration, obviously. And as distance increases, velocity decreases. When velocity drops, expansion becomes less reliable, which can cause penetration to increase and pass through to become more likely. At longer distances, even hollow point rounds can begin to behave more like a full metal jacket. So this creates an important dynamic. Bullet performance is not fixed, it changes based on velocity at impact. The most consistent performance occurs at closer ranges, where expansion is more reliable within that 50-yard range. So the key takeaway is straightforward. In handgun systems, bullet designs control the outcome, and when expansion fails, penetration becomes the dominant behavior. Okay? All right. Okay, so let's really hone in this handgun projectile behavior over distance, right? So distance doesn't just make things farther away, it changes how projectiles behave. Lower velocity systems like handguns experience greater change over distance. So at close range, a handgun round still has relatively high velocity, as shown in our ballistics gel here, which allows for more consistent expansion and energy transfer. But as distance increases, the same projectile slows down significantly. You can see in long range at 100 yards. So at longer ranges, velocity is lower, energy is reduced, and expansion becomes less reliable. The result is a noticeable shift in behavior, less expansion, and more variability in penetration. Rifle comparison. Rifle systems behave differently because they start at much higher velocities and they retain more performance over distance. So while handgun behavior changes significantly, rifle behavior remains more consistent. Velocity loss. The first key change is velocity loss as distance increases. Velocity decreases due to drag and air resistance. And handgun rounds lose velocity faster than rifle rounds. Okay, so next is energy loss. As velocity drops, kinetic energy drops even faster, and then less energy means less ability to do what it on impact, okay? Then comes expansion. Expansion depends on velocity thresholds, and when velocity falls below the threshold, expansion becomes inconsistent or fails entirely. At distance, a hollow point may behave more like a non-expanding round. So what changes overall? Across all of this, four things are changing. Velocity decreases, energy decreases, expansion reliability decreases, and penetration behavior can change. So these changes are not random. They are gradual, measurable, and predictable. The takeaway is clear. Distance amplifies the limitations of lower velocity systems and for handgun projectiles. And those changes become significant faster. Okay? So that is the physics, a breakout of how the two differences between the two systems. Okay? So let's move back into the analysis phase and cover the Monte Carlo simulation. Okay, so we're getting into one of the main parts of the analysis. What is a Monte Carlo simulation? A Monte Carlo simulation is a way to test a scenario, not once, but thousands of times. Each time, small variables change. The result is not a single answer, it's a range of possible outcomes. And more importantly, it shows which outcomes happen consistently and which ones don't. Okay? That's what makes it useful. Real world events are not perfectly known. They're always uncertainty. Instead of ignoring that uncertainty, this method measures it. So rather than guessing what happened, it tests what could have happened and it identifies what is most likely to happen. Okay. At a high level, the process or model is straightforward. Start with a scenario, define the key variables, then run that scenario thousands of times with small variations each time. When all those results are combined, patterns begin to emerge. Some outcomes appear repeatedly, others happen occasionally. That difference is what creates probability. Okay? From there, the process can be broken down step by step. So you have input, simulation, output, interpretation. So in this analysis, this method is used to test whether the observed evidence matches expected physical behavior. Different scenarios are simulated under realistic conditions, and the results show which explanations are consistent and which ones are not. All right? So we have this, we're running this simulation 1,000 times. We have our identified variables like, did they use a handgun? Did they use a rifle? Was it outside, inside? What distance was what it's at? And it randomly simulates those variables thousands of iterations, okay? And then you get your output distribution. So we know that handgun, targeted assassination, close range, those are what we consistently see in the data, right? Well, this model, we're going to simulate that. Do we see that same distribution in our simulation? Okay, if that helps bring it together. So we're testing our model. We're seeing if our data is close to what you would do in a random simulation. If it's close, that means our data and everything else we've said aligns, right? Okay. So this slide or image will help set up the Monte Carlo results because the two are correlated, and I'll explain why. But what this shows is it shows the alleged incident profile or the alleged Charlie Kirk incident. And it's alleged, right? A long-range rifle was used, a 30-06 ammunition with a bolt-action rifle. It was a distance attack, 160 yards from a rooftop. Highly planned, had to be highly planned because he got onto that campus just in time, able to get up there without raising any alarms, do that incident, get off the roof, get away without being caught, right? So there was some planning with it. This wasn't a random thing. And it was in a public setting. So this exact scenario actually occurs 4 times. So of 148 incidents, this incident profile represents 4 incidents in the data set. So that's 2.7% of all incidents. Okay. So with the Monte Carlo simulation, since we only have 148 incidents, that's a small set of data. So with a Monte Carlo simulation, we can simulate thousands of times to get to 100,000 random profiles. And when we look at the Monte Carlo simulation, we'll compare it to this, right? Maybe when we simulate, this incident profile is 20% if you do it randomly, right? Then that shows us that our data it doesn't align. It would cause errors. So let's move on to the simulation. So let's bring it all together from the observed of what we talked about, 2.7%. So only 4 incidents that match that Charlie Kirk incident profile, right? That scenario only occurs 2.7% of time in our data. That is already a low frequency event. To test whether this is random or structurally rare, a Monte Carlo simulation is applied, which we just talked about Thousands of randomized scenarios are generated using the same underlying variables. Under simulation, this scenario appears just 0.24% of the time. The simulated frequency is significantly lower than what is observed. This indicates the scenario is not only uncommon, it is difficult to reproduce even under broad randomized conditions. This confirms that the scenario is extremely rare. Rarity is not assumed. It is demonstrated. So I'm going to end this with my closing thoughts. But I want to do it in a different style. Let's say an investigator reached out and said, which they have not, by the way, just want to preference that. What did we miss? What are we not seeing in this case? What does your analysis show that we're not looking at? So I want to come in it from that specific angle, not just summarize everything we've talked about, but take all the analysis we've done and put it together, right? So I'm going to keep it analytical, look at the facts, use logic, and not conspiracies. All right. So, incident assessment, closing thoughts. Now, I might hop around here a bit. I try to put everything into these 6 buckets, but there could be some overlap. But let's start with the ballistic evidence limitations. We know that the bullet fragment came back inconclusive, right? So does that mean that was not the correct rifle? Was it a similar rifle, but that was not the one to use? It leaves a lot of ambiguity into the whole situation. That's such a key part of the evidence. Here's what I would say. I would say based on our incident profile, the most common, it involves a handgun, close range, public setting, targeted assassination attempt, and victim is a public figure within our data set. Okay? We know that what the scenario is for this incident is a very rare event. Okay? It's not very common. Now, I'm not saying that the ballistics evidence is a handgun bullet, but we know that handguns are the most common weapon system they used. And from 160 yards, you're not going to use a handgun. I mean, is it possible? Yes, but and we'll explore that a little bit through here because there are some data to back that up, or that might be, but I would say, all right, so we know that this evidence is inconclusive. We know that this is a rare event. Well, let's look at what the most common event type is and start from there. Let's rule that out. So I would say, can you confirm that nobody had a handgun at that event? Can you confirm within the close range audience that nobody fired off a handgun? Can you confirm that, right? That's the most common factor we see. Close range, the handgun specific weapon, public location, that accounts for like 80% of these incidents. So that would be my first thing. I would start there. Can you rule out all of these before going on or moving on with this other story, the current alleged, and you have to deal with inconclusive ballistic results, etc., right? That would be my first thing. Now, let's say that it is a rifle, right, from that distance. So if we look at the expected 30-06 outcome, and we went really heavy into these ballistics, terminal effect, we know that between 200 yards, so between 100 to 200 yards, regardless of that ammo you're seeing in Section 2, whether it's full metal jacket, match, soft point, ballistic tip, those are moving at between 2,200 to 118 feet per second. That is a lot of energy, right? Um, and if you look at the wound on Charlie, it doesn't necessarily reflect the outcome of that type of ammunition. Okay, and I want to be careful how I phrase this because if it were a full metal jacket, it would have a small initial cavity and penetrate deep and pass through. We know that there was no bullet pass through. Right? It was said that it was lodged in his body. There was a statement that his bones were so strong it was able to stop the bullet. Now, I'm not going to run that on that. That's more of an opinion or than it is like a data point. But the point is that there wasn't pass through. Okay. All right. So now let's look at match. Now this one actually is the one where there's still a lot of energy, but it's more for target shooting. So there's a lot of variability and unpredictability with this type of ammo, okay? Where it is possible you could get maybe that wound and lodged and things, but very unlikely, but it is more probable of any types of these ammunitions from the research we've done. Then you have the soft point and the ballistic tip. Those are hunting. Those are what you're using for going through big game, right? There would have been a very devastating outcome on his body if those were used. I don't want to get into it, the graphics, but it would have been a lot worse than what we saw. And once again, I want to reiterate with match, I'm not saying it is that. I'm just saying that of the ones, it doesn't have as deep penetration, right? It's doesn't expand. It can fragment or it's not intended for hunting big game, right? It's not intended to it's more designed for target shooting precision accuracy, okay? So the effects can be unpredictable. That's what I'm trying to say, okay? So to quickly sum that up, we know that with 30-06 ammunition, it's a high velocity system, moving very fast, high likelihood of pass through, meaning the bullet passes through the body. There's deep penetrations expected and a large energy transfer profile. So if we moved on to 3, what was observed? The terminal effects, what was noted, right? It was noted that there was fragmentation behavior present. There was no definitive pass-through profile. We know that there's in his body, right? And reduced penetration characteristics observed. The wound size or the cavity would have not been that of a 30-06 in most cases, right? I'm not saying that it is. I'm not the expert. I'm just based off the data and what we've put together. I would look at that and say it could be more typical of a handgun round, right? That doesn't mean that it is. It's just saying how it's looked or observed, the terminal effects seems more typical of a handgun round, right? So 4th part, scenario feasibility. If you look at here, you see the rifle system as a bolt action rifle. It's difficult to conceal. It has a way larger profile, right? And this is just my opinion. When I looked, I know how long these rifles are and how big they are. Just if you know anybody who's a hunter, chances are they probably have one of these. They're a big rifle. There's other rifle systems that you could use to conceal that the stock breaks down. It's just it's not one that I would typically associate with somebody getting into a backpack or a hiding in their pants. Not to say that that couldn't happen, right? I'm just saying just the logic or association, okay? And when you're, watching the video of him running across the roof and getting off, this is just an observation that I had. I found it interesting that there wasn't a sling on there. I think most people, if you have a rifle, there's a sling on there. So what a sling does, it almost you have the rifle's on your back and it's slinged, so you can climb, maneuver, jump, do other things. No, I didn't notice that. Is that a big thing? Probably not, but it's just something I noticed that I remember thinking that when I saw that. Right. Now with why you could say a handgun is maybe used in these larger crowd settings because it's easier to conceal. You could have it in a backpack. You could do all that. You could get in close in a crowd, depending on security. And it's just so it's a little bit easier to conceal. And you see that in the data with that when we go into 5 with that most common incident profile, right? This is what we most observe. When these incidents happen, this is the cadence, this is the profile based on the data. And then we did our Monte Carlo simulation to test that to see if our data was skewed or off. No, if anything, we found that when we simulated it, this scenario was more rare than our in the data. Okay, so what does that tell us when things are rare? Nothing. You can't. Causation isn't correlation to this. It just means it's a rare event. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen. Like I said, my framework or how I think about it is start with the most obvious, the most common, rule all that out, and then work your way to those more rare situations. That's how my brain or analytic mind works first, okay? When we look at this incident, yes, the victim is a public figure. The intent was a targeted hit. Setting was in a public location. Just the two things are that engagement distance and weapon, right? Okay. So now let's go on to the single actor assessment. We had a whole area about these types of things. They're very hard. I would say, I don't know this, right? But I'm just saying these types of incidents are very complex and there's multiple variables to account for, right? Could an individual set this up, do this all on their own? Yes, it is, right? But a lot of things have to go right for that individual to pull this off. A lot of things. There's timing involved. There's weather. There's security systems. There's cameras, angles. We know from the back end that when authorities relayed that all out, it's easy to find information on this because they're in these public settings. There's a lot of witnesses. There's a lot of cameras, right? And with technology, there's a lot of metadata that can be picked up. They can ping your cell phone, know where you're at, right? A lot of that stuff. So in that moment of the day it happened, a lot of things had to go right for the suspect to pull this off. Okay, like I said. And we know afterwards that he was able to get away undetected, which is, I'm not saying is improbable, right, to do it by yourself, but it's a lot to do just as you're alone. I'm just trying to be very careful how I phrase this because there's no proof that anybody helped him. But if I was the authority and I saw all this, I would instantly try to see if somebody helped him. Just knowing how complex these situations are and all the things that had to go right. I would definitely look into that avenue, whether it be the roommate, whatever. I don't know. Um, and maybe they do have evidence of that and it just isn't publicly known. I don't know, right? I'm just basing this all on today. But yeah, that's my closing thoughts. If you made it this far, I appreciate you being here and walking through this with me. Hopefully you have a better understanding of what's happening with this case and all the different parts involved. I think there are other YouTubers talking about it and with some great insight as well. Like I said, no matter where you stand politically or how you felt about this individual, everybody can step back and realize, yes, there's some odd things about this, and justice and truth are always important, right? No matter what. So I appreciate y'all. Thank you so much. I'll catch me for the next video.